Let's talk a little bit more about giving this week. I don't know if you're like me and you grew up in church. I've been in church my entire life, and so I've heard a lot of sermons on giving. I have heard a lot of teaching on giving. And one of the most popular passages I think that people will often go to is Matthew 6. So in Matthew 6, I'm going to read you this really quick text here, beginning in Matthew 6, verse 2. It says this: "Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you like the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be done in secret, and your Father who sees what is in secret will reward you." So this verse, it's a verse we like to use. I don't know, I think it's an interesting verse, and maybe because it's memorable, we use it a lot. But where it says, "Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing," so that, right, so that your giving can be done in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So a lot of times when we talk about giving, we say you have to give in secret. If you let people know that you've given, if you talk to people about the fact that you've given, then it disqualifies you from the reward. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about that is here in the book of Matthew, Jesus is talking about the hypocrites, the Pharisees. And he's already said in Matthew 5, 19 and 20 that unless your righteousness is better than the Pharisees, you'll never see the kingdom of heaven. And so what he's doing here, I don't think, is giving a model for how Christians should behave. He is revealing the fact that the way that the Pharisees are doing things. Remember, the Pharisees of the day were considered the righteous people. They were considered the standard for righteousness. And what Jesus is doing is he's exposing their works, and he's exposing, at the core of it, he's exposing the heart behind their works. That their intention really was just about getting praise from men. And so what God says here, what Christ says, is that when you give, don't give like the hypocrites do, for they give with pomp and circumstance. They do all of that so that they can be seen by men. So the motive of their hearts is to be seen by men, and they receive the reward in full. He'll use the similar language with praying and with fasting, that the Pharisees, the hypocrites, they pray on the street corners to be seen by men, and they get their reward in full. It's the applause of men, the pat on the back, right? But God says, but let your praying be done in secret. And he says, let your fasting be done in secret. And so what Christ is addressing here is the heart. Now, what's interesting about this is not a text that we can apply across the board to Christian giving. It is a text where Jesus is exposing the false righteousness of the Pharisees and saying, look, if you want to be righteous because you give, if you want to be righteous because you fast and you pray, it can't be done like the Pharisees do it. It has to be done differently than that. Now, what's interesting about that is none of the church ever follows this rule. This is one of the ways that we know that this is not a guideline for us on how we're supposed to give. Because if you go to Acts 4, and we see that in Acts 4, all the saints are meeting together, and they are all meeting each other's needs. Now, in Acts 4, what has happened is Greek-speaking Jews from around the world have come to Jerusalem for Pentecost. While there, we know that Peter and some of the other apostles, maybe all 120 of them, were gifted with the power of speaking in tongues, and the people heard the gospel preached in their own language. And so what ended up happening was about 3,000 people put their faith in Jesus. Now, these people had come to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost, and they were about to go back home. But now they're staying around in Jerusalem, they're being discipled, and the result of that was they didn't have enough money with them. They didn't have enough sustenance with them to take care of them. And so the Bible says this in Acts 4, "Now the full number of those who had believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they shared everything in common, and with great power the apostles were giving their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord, and great grace was up on them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of what was sold, and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each one as they had need." So there's a very public kind of thing happening here where people are selling their property, and they're coming in before the apostles, and they're saying, look, like we want to meet the needs of these people who are in Jerusalem. We want to meet the needs of these new brothers and sisters of ours. And not only that, but if you go over to 2 Corinthians, and in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, the longest text we have about giving, this is Paul reminding the Corinthian church of the promise that they had made to relieve the hardship of the saints in Jerusalem. And he says this in 2 Corinthians 8, he says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches in Macedonia. For in severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in the wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can attest, and not only that, but beyond their means of their own free will, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this was not as we expected, but first they gave themselves to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. So here's what it says. Paul is encouraging the Corinthian church to give a gift that they had promised for the relief of the saints. And he says the Macedonian churches, which are destitute churches, poor churches, they also asked if they could give in the relief of the saints. And I want you to see why. I want you to see why the Macedonians had asked to share in this gift. 2 Corinthians 9, Paul says, "Now it's superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness," talking to the Corinthian church, "I know that you're ready to share with their needs. For I know your readiness, of which I boasted about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia," that's Corinth, "had been ready since last year, and your zeal stirred up most of them." All right, so here's what happened. Paul had heard from the Corinthian church that they wanted to give a gift to the saints in Jerusalem. And Paul, when he rolls into Macedonia, starts telling the Macedonians how generous the church in Corinth was and how the church in Corinth wanted to take up a gift for the saints in Jerusalem. And that giving stirred up the hearts of the Macedonians then to also give. So what I want you to see is that what Jesus is addressing in Matthew 6 isn't Christian giving. It's not how Christians should give, that we have to give in secret. What Christ is addressing is the heart. And we'll talk more about that next week. That's super important to talk about the motives behind giving. We want to look at a little bit more in detail in Matthew 6 next week. But what I want you to consider now, what I want you to consider today, is that Jesus is rebuking and mocking the Pharisees because they're only seeking the praise of men. But in Acts 4, we see the Christians sharing all things in common and people selling their land and their property and sharing with the saints. It was very public. And that we see also that Paul talks pretty readily about the gift of the Corinthian church while he's ministering in the Macedonian church. This isn't to say that the Corinthian church is robbed of the reward now. It is to say that giving is a matter of the heart. It's what is your motive? We'll talk about that next week a little bit more. But I want you to think about this right now. Have you ever been taught that you can't give publicly because then you lose your reward? And then the question that we've got to ask is then, on what basis is our righteousness intact? Are we blessed by God because of what we do and how we do it? Or are we blessed by God because of who Jesus is and what he does? But what I want you to consider is that if Jesus is really saying that Christian giving must be done in secret, then in Acts, the first apostles did not follow that model. And then in Corinthians, Paul the apostle did not follow that model. And so there has to be some dialogue about that. What's the difference between the Matthew 6 text and the Acts 4 and the 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 text? And what we'll find is that the difference is Jesus is addressing self-made, human, man-made righteousness. And what Acts 4 and what's happening in Corinthians is really about the generous heart of the church and how when people in the church are generous, not only does it meet the needs of other people in the church, but the generosity of people in the church stirs up others to give as well. So think about those things. Let's talk about that a little bit more. And next week we'll be back in Matthew 6 because we really do want to focus more on the heart behind giving. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you soon.